In the opening years of World War II, the German army had become synonymous with speed, coordination, and the thunder of its armored columns. The Wehrmacht's panzer divisions cut through Poland, France, and the Low Countries with such efficiency that their reputation seemed unassailable. To many of Germany's generals, their tanks, the Panzer III and Panzer IV, soon to be followed by the formidable Tiger and Panther, represented the pinnacle of armored warfare. They were heavier, faster, and more technologically refined than anything most opponents could field. Against this backdrop, early reports of American tanks arriving in North Africa elicited not alarm but derision. The Germans had faced and defeated British Matildas, French Char BS, and Soviet T-20 SIXS. Why would they fear an American design? They mocked the M3 Lee and Stuart tanks, calling them undergunned, underarmored, and hopelessly outdated. At this stage, the United States was still mobilizing. Its industrial base was vast but had not yet been fully turned toward total war. The first tanks sent overseas were indeed light, experimental, or transitional designs. They were meant to give American cruise experience rather than to dominate the battlefield. German commanders observing these machines drew the wrong conclusion, that America simply did not know how to build effective armored fighting vehicles. They laughed at the thought of mass American armor, imagining that any such force would be little more than a rolling graveyard. Yet behind the scenes, in Detroit and across dozens of other industrial hubs, a quiet revolution was underway. This revolution was driven by two interlocking forces: America's unmatched industrial capacity and its ability to standardize production. Where Germany prized craftsmanship and incremental upgrades, the United States embraced assembly lines, interchangeable parts, and sheer volume. Engineers at Chrysler, Ford, and other firms were retooling entire plants to produce tanks the way they had produced cars. Military planners understood that the next phase of the war would require not a handful of elite machines but thousands of reliable, easy-to-maintain tanks supported by an army of mechanics, spare parts, and logistical networks. They were betting that quantity had a quality all its own. Even before the Sherman tank officially entered combat, the philosophy behind it was clear. The M4 Sherman would not be the heaviest, fastest, or most heavily armed tank on the battlefield. Instead, it would be the most numerous, the easiest to repair, and the quickest to produce. It would be adaptable, capable of mounting different guns, flamethrowers, or engineering gear. It would be light enough to ship across oceans and rugged enough to fight in deserts, forests, and urban rubble. In this way, the Sherman represented a deliberate choice: to field a good enough tank backed by overwhelming numbers rather than a perfect tank available only in small batches. German generals, steeped in a tradition of high-performance engineering, could not comprehend this approach. They viewed the battlefield as a contest of specifications, armor thickness, gun caliber, engine horsepower. On paper, the Sherman appeared inferior to the Panzer IV, let alone the Tiger. They compared individual matchups and dismissed the Sherman as little more than a moving target. But war is not fought on paper. It is fought by organizations, supply chains, and the ability to sustain operations day after day. In this realm, America was preparing to deliver a shock unlike anything the Wehrmacht had experienced. The first hints of this shock came in North Africa. American armored units, still learning the basics of combined arms warfare, struggled against experienced German commanders like Erwin Rommel. Tank for tank, the Americans suffered. Yet even in defeat, a pattern emerged. Fresh units and fresh equipment kept arriving. Losses could be replaced. Crews gained experience. Tactics improved. Logistics functioned. German officers noticed that, unlike the British or Soviets early in the war, the Americans seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of vehicles and parts. What they did not yet realize was that the M4 Sherman, the true backbone of America's armored force, was about to enter the field in massive numbers. Meanwhile, in the factories back home, production schedules were accelerating at a dizzying pace. Entire city blocks were converted into assembly lines for tanks. Workers trained in automotive manufacturing adapted to military production with astonishing speed. Thousands of women, minorities, and rural migrants joined the workforce, learning to weld, rivet, and assemble under wartime urgency. Each month the output grew. The numbers being planned were staggering: tens of thousands of tanks, plus spare parts, plus recovery vehicles, plus ammunition. Germany, by contrast, was struggling to replace its own losses while simultaneously fighting on the Eastern Front and defending against Allied bombing raids. The laughter of German generals at American armor was rooted not only in contempt but also in ignorance. They did not know the scale of the U.S. industrial effort. Intelligence reports underestimated American production. Propaganda reassured them that their own designs were invincible. Within this echo chamber, it was easy to dismiss the Sherman as yet another underpowered Allied tank doomed to burn. But the battlefield would soon tell a different story. When thousands of Shermans rolled off the docks and onto the fields of Europe, quantity would overwhelm quality, and the Germans would be forced to reassess their assumptions. At the same time, the Americans were developing a doctrine to match their new hardware. Combined arms, close air support, artillery coordination, and robust supply lines would allow the Sherman to fight not as an isolated machine but as part of a mobile ecosystem. Tank destroyers, self-propelled artillery, and tactical air power would complement its strengths and offset its weaknesses. This was the American way of war, not a duel between knights in armor but a system of systems designed to wear down and outmaneuver the enemy. German commanders, accustomed to facing piecemeal Allied efforts, were unprepared for the scale and integration of this approach. Thus, the stage was set. In 1942 and 1943, as the Sherman rolled off assembly lines in numbers no one had seen before, the laughter of German generals began to fade into unease. Reports from the front described American units re-equipping overnight, wrecked tanks replaced by new ones, crews rotated and retrained with minimal disruption. This was something fundamentally new in warfare, an enemy whose capacity to replace losses was effectively unlimited within the timescale of a campaign. The Germans had built formidable tanks but could not build enough of them. The Americans had built a competent tank and could build them endlessly. This asymmetry would define the armored battles to come. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, the M4 Sherman had become a symbol of Allied momentum. Though still technically outclassed by the heaviest German tanks, its sheer ubiquity and the support structure behind it made it a decisive factor. German generals who had once mocked the idea of mass American armor now faced waves of it, advancing relentlessly across the hedgerows of France. Every knocked-out Sherman seemed to be replaced by two more. Every tactical success against them only delayed the inevitable. In this crucible, the Sherman would prove its worth, not as a dueling champion but as the backbone of an army that refused to stop. This was the transformation underway, the shift from mockery to respect, from underestimation to grim acknowledgement. In the early war years, the German high command had laughed at American tanks. Soon they would have to contend with the reality of the Sherman, not as an isolated curiosity but as an industrial juggernaut. The numbers were coming, and with them a new kind of warfare. The age of mass mechanized production had arrived on the battlefield, and no amount of technical superiority could withstand it indefinitely. By the spring of 1943, American forces were learning hard lessons in Tunisia. The battles at Kasserine Pass and along the North African front revealed how vulnerable early U.S. armor was to seasoned German troops wielding 88mm guns and disciplined combined arms tactics. Yet while German commanders congratulated themselves for another triumph, a deeper shift was already underway. Every setback became a classroom. American officers analyzed after-action reports, interviewed tank crews, and mapped out their own weaknesses with brutal honesty. They improved communication between infantry, armor, and artillery. They adjusted their tactics to exploit their strengths, mobility, logistics, and air support. Out of these bruising encounters came a sharpened, more confident U.S. armored force, one about to be equipped with the Sherman in overwhelming numbers. The Sherman tank began arriving in North Africa in increasing quantities through 1943. When American soldiers first saw the M4 rolling off the docks, they noticed the difference immediately. Compared to the older M3 Lee or light Stuart, the Sherman's silhouette was lower, its gun longer, and its armor thicker. Crews praised its reliability. It started up in the mornings, its engine rarely overheated, and it could endure long marches over rough terrain. German troops who first encountered the Sherman did not immediately panic. It still could not outgun a Panzer IV at long range, and it certainly could not match a Tiger one-on-one. But they began to see more of them, day after day, week after week, replacing losses faster than they could destroy them. This was new. Even more striking was the Sherman's adaptability. Engineers had designed it with a standardized chassis and roomy interior, allowing upgrades and variants without interrupting production. Soon, some Shermans carried a high-velocity 76mm gun, others mounted flamethrowers for bunker assaults, still others were converted into mine-clearing tanks, amphibious DD models for beach landings, or armored recovery vehicles. This modularity meant that as the war evolved, the Sherman could evolve with it, without the design bottlenecks that plagued German manufacturers struggling to maintain multiple tank models simultaneously. For the Wehrmacht, accustomed to fighting static versions of enemy vehicles, this was another rude awakening. The industrial story behind the Sherman became almost as legendary as the tank itself. Chrysler's Detroit Arsenal tank plant, for instance, was producing a new Sherman roughly every hour at its peak. Ford, Baldwin, and other firms joined in, creating a network of production unmatched anywhere else in the world. While Germany hand-built its Tigers in small batches, America rolled Shermans off assembly lines like automobiles. This disparity mattered because war is as much about attrition as tactics. Every tank knocked out needed a replacement. Every new offensive required reserves. The Sherman allowed the Allies to plan on a scale the Germans could not match, coordinating armor with air power and artillery in sweeping offensives rather than cautious thrusts. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army was refining its doctrine to fit this new machine. Combined arms became more than a buzzword, it became a living practice. Infantry learned to work closely with tanks, signaling targets and clearing anti-tank positions. Artillery was coordinated by radio to suppress threats before Shermans advanced. Air power, especially P-47 Thunderbolts and later P-51 Mustangs, provided close air support, strafing and bombing German positions to soften resistance. The Sherman was rarely alone. Even when a Tiger tank outmatched it technically, the Sherman's supporting cast made the duel uneven. This was exactly how American planners intended it. They never saw the Sherman as an invincible duelist but as a piece of a combined puzzle. As production ramped up, the psychological impact on German commanders became harder to ignore. Reports flowed in from the front describing an enemy with seemingly limitless machines. Destroying one unit accomplished nothing, another appeared the next week. Ammunition dumps, spare parts, and recovery vehicles followed the Shermans everywhere. Damaged tanks were hauled back, repaired, and sent out again in days. For an army like the Wehrmacht, already stretched thin across multiple fronts, this was alarming. They had built their reputation on blitzkrieg, on shattering opponents faster than they could recover. But the Americans refused to shatter. They bent, adapted, and came back stronger, more numerous, and better coordinated. Another key factor was crew survivability and morale. The Sherman's interior layout, though criticized for thin armor, had a surprising benefit. It was easier for crews to escape. Fire suppression systems and better hatches meant that many American tankers survived hits that would have killed crews in other tanks. This experience built veteran crews faster, as survivors of one engagement returned to fight another, bringing their hard-earned lessons with them. German crews, facing high attrition and replacement difficulties, could not match this cycle. Over time, the qualitative edge of German tankers eroded while American proficiency grew. Allied intelligence also played a role. Ultra-decrypts and aerial reconnaissance gave U.S. commanders insights into German deployments, allowing them to mass armor where it would be most effective. The Sherman's mechanical reliability meant they could execute long, coordinated thrusts without worrying about breakdowns halting the advance. German tanks, powerful but complex, often required maintenance that slowed their operations. In a war of movement, the side that could keep moving and keep fighting gained an outsized advantage, and the Sherman was built to keep moving. This period also marked the rise of the U.S. logistical miracle. Supply lines stretched from American factories to African ports, across the Mediterranean, and into forward depots feeding the front lines. Ships, trains, and trucks moved an endless river of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. The Sherman standardization simplified this process. One set of parts fit most models, one training regimen prepared mechanics, one doctrine guided their use. German forces, by contrast, struggled with an ever-expanding menu of vehicles and parts, each requiring specialized maintenance and unique supply chains. This logistical asymmetry grew more punishing with each passing month. By mid-1943, as the Allies prepared to invade Sicily and Italy, the Sherman was no longer an untested newcomer but the backbone of a growing armored juggernaut. American tank battalions rolled ashore in organized waves, supported by naval gunfire and air bombardment. German defenders found themselves outflanked and outnumbered, forced to retreat to new defensive lines again and again. Although the terrain of Italy limited large tank battles, the message was clear. Wherever the Americans went, the Sherman followed, and in numbers that defied belief. Even German soldiers began to notice the pattern. Memoirs and diaries from the period record their grudging respect for the Americans' ability to keep coming. Like swarms, one officer wrote, "They replace what is lost before we can recover." This was not hyperbole. It was the manifestation of a new kind of warfare, one rooted not in a single weapon's superiority but in a nation's industrial might and organizational skill. The Sherman tank was both symbol and instrument of this power, carrying American soldiers forward in a tide that would eventually engulf Nazi Germany. As the summer of 1943 gave way to autumn, the stage was set for the next great challenge, the invasion of Western Europe itself. The lessons learned in North Africa and Italy, the production reaching its zenith, and the refined tactics all converged. When the Allies finally landed in Normandy, they would bring with them not just thousands of ships and planes but also a rolling steel army of Shermans ready to punch through Hitler's fortress Europe. For the German generals who had once laughed at American armor, the sound of hundreds of Shermans clanking ashore would be the death knell of their underestimation. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, the great gamble began. Allied forces poured onto the beaches of Normandy in the largest amphibious invasion in history. Behind the waves of infantry, naval gunfire, and air bombardment stood the promise of mechanized power, thousands of tanks and vehicles ready to transform a precarious foothold into a rolling front. Among them, the M4 Sherman was everywhere. On landing craft and on specially modified DD amphibious versions, Shermans bobbed toward the shore, their propellers churning the surf. Many sank under fire or in rough seas, but enough made it to land to support the infantry in the brutal fighting for the beachheads. For German defenders who had prepared for an invasion, the sight of so many Shermans crawling off the sand was the first hint of the tidal wave still to come. The Sherman's role on D-Day was not glamorous, but it was indispensable. In the chaos of beach assaults, tanks provided mobile cover, fire support against bunkers, and a psychological anchor for infantry struggling through machine gun fire. Each surviving Sherman on Omaha, Utah, Juneau, and Gold Beaches became a focal point for soldiers pushing inland. Crews who managed to keep their tanks running under enemy fire earned the gratitude of entire companies of infantry. German commanders watching from their bunkers could not help noticing the persistence of the American armor. Even when knocked out, new tanks seemed to appear. This was not a few isolated armored vehicles. It was a sustained force projecting itself across a hostile shoreline. Once the Allies secured a tenuous line, the Sherman began to demonstrate the quality that had always been its greatest strength: relentless availability. Within days of the landings, replacement tanks were rolling off ships, driving directly into assembly areas, and moving up to the front. Mechanics worked around the clock to repair damaged vehicles, cannibalize wrecks for parts, and return serviceable Shermans to action. This kind of logistical turnaround was unheard of in German experience. In the Wehrmacht, a tank lost on the Eastern Front might never be replaced. In the U.S. Army, a tank lost in Normandy might be replaced within a week. As the battle for Normandy ground on, the Sherman fought in one of the most challenging terrains imaginable, the bocage, a maze of hedgerows, sunken lanes, and stone farmhouses that turned every advance into an ambush. German defenders equipped with Panzerfausts, Panzerschrecks, and anti-tank guns turned the countryside into a killing field. Initially, Sherman struggled. Their standard tactics, designed for open terrain, left them vulnerable. Losses mounted. But once again, American adaptability showed itself. Engineers welded hedgerow cutters to the fronts of Shermans, allowing them to punch through earthen banks and surprise defenders. Infantry and armor began to coordinate more tightly, using artillery to blast suspected ambushes before tanks advanced. Air support struck German strongpoints. Slowly, methodically, the Allies began to break through. The scale of the Sherman deployment meant that lessons learned in one sector could be applied across an entire army group within days. New tactics, new equipment, and new coordination spread like wildfire. German commanders, constrained by dwindling resources and rigid hierarchies, could not adapt at the same speed. Their Tiger and Panther tanks, though formidable, were too few and too precious to risk recklessly. Every loss was a strategic blow. American commanders, by contrast, could mass Shermans for breakthroughs, accept losses, and keep advancing. This difference in operational philosophy became starkly visible in battles like St. Lo and Operation Cobra, where Allied armor finally punched through the German lines and into open country. Once in open terrain, the Shermans' mobility and reliability came into their own. American armored divisions surged forward, bypassing strong points and enveloping German units. Fuel trucks and repair crews kept pace, ensuring the spearheads did not run dry. Air power roamed overhead, strafing retreating columns and cutting supply lines. The German army, once the master of blitzkrieg, now found itself on the receiving end of a mechanized onslaught it could not match. The very tactics Germany had pioneered, speed, concentration, and combined arms, were being used against them by an opponent with far greater industrial depth. Another overlooked advantage of the Sherman during this phase was communications. American tanks came equipped with reliable radios, allowing platoon leaders and company commanders to coordinate movements, call for artillery, and adjust tactics on the fly. German tanks, especially late-war models, often lacked standardized or functional radios, forcing crews to rely on hand signals or pre-planned maneuvers. In the fluid battles of France, this difference in communication translated directly into battlefield effectiveness. Sherman units could maneuver like a single organism, adapting to changing conditions in real time, while German units often acted in isolation. By August 1944, the breakout from Normandy had transformed the Western Front. American and British forces surged across France in a series of rapid advances that left German high command scrambling. Shermans rolled through liberated towns, cheered by civilians who saw in the olive-drab tanks a symbol of liberation. German forces attempted counterattacks, most famously at Mortain, but were beaten back by coordinated Allied firepower. The sheer density of Allied armor meant that even successful German ambushes could not stem the tide. Each knocked-out Sherman was quickly replaced, each lost crew position was filled, each setback became a footnote in a relentless advance toward the German border. The psychological impact on German troops was profound. Soldiers who had been taught that the Reich's technology was invincible now saw it being swamped. Tank crews dreaded the omnipresent fighter bombers above and the never-ending columns of Shermans below. Infantry spoke of fighting an enemy who never seems to run out. Even German civilians, reading between the lines of official communiques, began to sense that something had shifted, that the war machine on which they had pinned their hopes was being outproduced and outmaneuvered on every front. Meanwhile, the Sherman itself continued to evolve. The introduction of the M4A3 variant with improved armor, better engines, and high-velocity guns gave crews more confidence. Firefly versions supplied by the British mounted powerful 17-pounder guns capable of penetrating even the heaviest German armor. Specialized engineering versions cleared mines, launched bridges, and supported infantry assaults. This versatility meant that as the Allies approached the German frontier, they brought with them not just tanks but a full suite of armored solutions to any battlefield problem. The Sherman was no longer just a tank, it was a family of machines underpinning a mechanized ecosystem. All of this combined to erode the tactical advantages of German armor. A Tiger tank might dominate a single field for a single afternoon, but the Sherman force would regroup, flank it, call in artillery or air strikes, and return with overwhelming numbers. American commanders learned to exploit this asymmetry, using Shermans to pin German tanks while anti-tank guns or fighter bombers finished the job. Losses were accepted as part of a larger calculus, one the Americans could afford and the Germans could not. As the summer of 1944 turned to autumn, Allied forces stood at the gates of Germany. The laughter of German generals at American tanks was long gone, replaced by grim respect and a dawning realization that the industrial weight of the United States had transformed the battlefield. What had begun as mockery of inferior tanks had become a nightmare of attrition, adaptation, and unrelenting advance. The Sherman had proven its worth not by being invincible but by being inevitable. As the Allies crossed into Germany's western borders in late 1944, the Sherman tank had already become a fixture of the battlefield. Entire armored divisions rolled across the Siegfried Line, supporting infantry, engineers, and artillery in coordinated assaults. Yet this phase of the war would test the Sherman and its crews like never before. The terrain grew more constricted, the weather colder, and the enemy more desperate. German industry, though battered by bombing, still managed to produce advanced weapons. Newer versions of the Panther and Tiger II, along with deadly anti-tank guns and increasing numbers of Panzerfaust armed infantry, posed grave threats to Allied armor. Even so, the Sherman's greatest advantage, its numbers, adaptability, and logistical support, continued to shift the balance. By autumn 1944, the Allies faced the formidable challenge of the West Wall, a dense network of bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, and minefields stretching along Germany's western frontier. Here the Sherman became not only a weapon but a tool of siege-breaking. Engineers used Sherman chassis to mount bulldozer blades, mine flails, and bridge-laying equipment. Tank infantry teams probed weak points, while artillery and air strikes pounded fortifications ahead of each assault. Though losses were heavy, each breakthrough widened the Allied foothold inside Germany. German commanders, increasingly starved of fuel and replacements, watched their elite panzer divisions dwindle. Each Tiger lost was irreplaceable, each Panther destroyed shortened the Reich's ability to resist. In the midst of this grinding advance came one of the war's most dramatic counterattacks, the Battle of the Bulge. In December 1944, the German army launched a massive offensive through the Ardennes, aiming to split the Allied lines and recapture the initiative. In this snowy, forested terrain, tanks were both a blessing and a liability. German forces, spearheaded by Panthers and Tiger IIs, initially punched through thin American defenses. Entire units were overrun. Towns like Bastogne became besieged islands. The Sherman, with its thinner armor and less powerful gun, faced perhaps its sternest test of the war. Yet once again, numbers, organization, and adaptability told. As the weather cleared, Allied air power returned with devastating effect, hammering German columns and supply lines. Reinforcements poured into the Bulge, fresh infantry, artillery, and crucially, more Shermans. American units that had been caught off guard regrouped, counterattacked, and stabilized the line. Where a Panther might destroy several Shermans in an engagement, the Americans simply brought more and coordinated their attacks to outflank and overwhelm. Tank destroyers, artillery barrages, and close air support combined to blunt the German spearheads. By January 1945, the great gamble had failed. The German army had expended its last reserves, and the Allies were poised to drive into the heart of the Reich. The Ardennes also highlighted another of the Sherman's often overlooked virtues, cold weather reliability. Whereas complex German tanks frequently struggled to start in freezing conditions, the Sherman's simpler mechanics allowed it to function more consistently. This reliability meant American units could reposition quickly, exploit breakthroughs, and maintain pressure even in the harshest conditions. Mechanics carried ample spare parts, and the standardized design simplified repairs. In contrast, German crews often had to abandon or blow up disabled tanks they could no longer move or refuel. In a war of attrition, even such mundane details became decisive. As winter turned to spring, the Allies unleashed a final, massive offensive into Germany. By March 1945, they were crossing the Rhine River. Engineers erected pontoon bridges while amphibious Shermans and other specialized vehicles secured the far bank. The speed of this advance astonished even seasoned commanders. In some areas, German resistance collapsed entirely. In others, pockets of fierce fighting erupted, especially around cities and key river crossings. The Sherman was there at every stage, its olive-drab hulls now as common a sight as the jeeps and trucks that followed in its wake. This phase of the war also saw the Sherman integrated ever more tightly with new technologies. Forward observers in Shermans could call in fighter bombers or heavy artillery strikes with unprecedented speed. Radar, improved mapping, and coordinated supply convoys allowed armored thrusts to move with clockwork precision. Each advance was not just a show of force but a demonstration of logistical mastery, fuel arriving on time, ammunition stacked where needed, and replacement tanks always in the pipeline. German commanders, even when they mounted local counterattacks, found themselves smothered under this industrial rhythm. For the German soldiers on the ground, the psychological toll deepened. Memoirs described the despair of facing not only more tanks than they could count but also the realization that those tanks would not run out. The Sherman had become a rolling metaphor for Allied persistence. It kept moving forward, across rivers, through forests, into towns reduced to rubble. Its crews, many now veterans of multiple campaigns, fought with confidence born of experience and the knowledge that support was always close at hand. The myth of German technological invincibility was shattered. What remained was a grim defense of the homeland against a foe whose resources dwarfed their own. As Allied forces captured German cities, Cologne, Mainz, and hundreds more, Shermans became an everyday presence. Civilians saw them rumble through the streets, their white stars painted against soot-blackened walls. To many, the tanks represented both defeat and liberation. For Allied troops, they were simply workhorses, carrying them forward one village at a time. In this grinding endgame, there were no grand maneuvers or sudden breakthroughs, only steady pressure and the inevitable collapse of a regime running out of time. Importantly, the Sherman's production did not slacken even as victory loomed. Factories in the United States kept shipping tanks, parts, and vehicles to Europe, ensuring the Allied armies could maintain their tempo. This continuity prevented the logistical pauses that might have allowed Germany to regroup. It also prepared the Allies for the possibility of fighting deeper into Central Europe or even against Japan after Germany's defeat. By war's end, over 49,000 Shermans had been built, a number that dwarfed the combined total of Germany's heavy tanks many times over. By April 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing on all fronts. Soviet forces closed in from the east, while American, British, and Canadian armies advanced from the west. In this final act, the Sherman was both symbol and instrument of Allied victory. German generals who had once sneered at inferior American tanks now faced surrender at the hands of armies built around them. The laughter that had greeted the first reports of U.S. armor in 1942 had turned into resignation, even admiration for the sheer scale of the achievement. The Sherman had not only proven itself as a tank but as a testament to what industrial democracy could accomplish in total war. By the spring of 1945, the story of the Sherman tank had become inseparable from the story of the Allied advance itself. From the beaches of Normandy to the bridges of the Rhine, the olive-drab silhouette of the M4 symbolized more than just a fighting machine. It represented the industrial and organizational will of an entire nation. Even as Germany collapsed, the lessons of this tank war were shaping military thinking for generations to come. American commanders, reflecting on the campaigns they had fought, saw clearly that the Sherman had been not merely a weapon but an instrument of strategy, a bridge between mass production and battlefield power. In the closing months of the European War, Sherman crews encountered a landscape of devastation. German cities lay in ruins, their transportation networks shattered, their once proud panzer divisions reduced to fragments. Yet even in retreat, the Wehrmacht could still fight savagely. Isolated Tiger and Panther tanks ambushed Allied columns from ruined factories or dense woods. Volkssturm units, armed with Panzerfausts, hid in basements and alleyways, striking at close range. For Sherman crews, these final battles demanded caution, coordination, and relentless pressure. They learned to treat every intersection as a potential trap, every building as a fortress. The tank infantry teamwork honed over years became second nature, a reflex that saved lives. The Sherman's versatility remained a decisive advantage in these urban and semi-urban battles. Specialized variants led the way. Bulldozer blade Shermans cleared rubble, flamethrower models flushed out strong points, and recovery tanks hauled away wrecks under fire. In some cases, engineers mounted bridges directly on Sherman hulls, creating instant crossings over canals or bomb craters. This modularity allowed American units to improvise solutions to battlefield problems without waiting for entirely new vehicles to arrive. German defenders, by contrast, were improvising in desperation, repurposing civilian vehicles or captured Allied gear to fill gaps. The supply system that had kept Shermans fighting since North Africa still pulsed with undiminished vigor. Trains, trucks, and ships carried replacement tanks and parts across thousands of miles to the front lines. This logistical rhythm meant that even in the heart of Germany, the Allied armies could sustain their offensives without long pauses. Every knocked-out Sherman could be replaced, every damaged one could be repaired or cannibalized. This predictability allowed planners to risk bold maneuvers, knowing their armored spearheads would not run dry. Meanwhile, the psychological balance had shifted completely. German soldiers no longer mocked the Sherman, they feared the combined system it represented. They knew that behind every tank lay a pipeline of support, air power, and manpower they could not match. Memoirs from the period speak of fighting waves, or endless lines of American armor, of the hopelessness of destroying a dozen tanks only to see 24 more appear the next day. This despair undermined the cohesion of German units, accelerating the Reich's unraveling. The Sherman also played a key role in liberating prisoner-of-war camps and concentration camps as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany. Many of the first Allied vehicles to arrive at places like Buchenwald and Dachau were Shermans, their crews among the first outsiders to witness the atrocities committed there. Photographs from April 1945 show Shermans parked outside the gates of these camps, their white stars stark against the barbed wire. For survivors, these tanks became icons of deliverance. For the soldiers, they were grim reminders of what the war had been about beyond territory and tactics. Even as victory approached, American engineers and planners were already thinking about the next war. They analyzed Sherman combat reports, tested new gun designs, and debated the balance between armor, firepower, and mobility. This forward-looking mindset reflected the core lesson of the Sherman experience. No single weapon, however advanced, can decide a war on its own. Victory lay in systems, production, logistics, training, and adaptability. The Sherman was proof that a good enough tank, built in overwhelming numbers and supported properly, could defeat technically superior machines. In this context, it's instructive to compare the Sherman to the German Tiger II, also known as the King Tiger. The Tiger II was a marvel of engineering, heavily armored, heavily armed, and terrifying on the battlefield. Yet it was also plagued by mechanical problems, difficult to transport, and slow to produce. Only a few hundred were built. Each breakdown consumed scarce resources. Each loss was irreplaceable. In contrast, the Sherman was a model of efficiency and standardization. It may not have matched the King Tiger's specifications, but it utterly outclassed it in strategic utility. The Sherman could be shipped, repaired, modified, and fielded anywhere. Its crews could be trained quickly. Its parts could be swapped easily. This is why, despite its flaws, the Sherman ultimately outlasted its rival. Another important element was the maturity of Allied combined arms doctrine by 1945. American tankers no longer expected to duel German armor head-to-head. Instead, they coordinated with tank destroyers, artillery, and airstrikes to neutralize heavy enemy tanks. Shermans advanced with infantry screens, reconnaissance units scouted ahead, and engineers cleared obstacles. Each element supported the others. This choreography turned the battlefield into a stage where the Sherman played its part to maximum effect. Even the dreaded ambush by a Tiger or an 88mm gun could be answered with pre-planned fire missions or air sorties. In this integrated system, the Sherman thrived. The closing battles also underscored the human dimension of armored warfare. Sherman crews who had survived from North Africa through France and into Germany formed tight-knit teams, bonded by shared danger and experience. They named their tanks, painted slogans on the hulls, and developed an intuitive sense of each other's reactions. This cohesion, multiplied across thousands of crews, gave the U.S. armored force a resilience far beyond its technical specifications. German crews, suffering high casualties and frequent unit disbandments, could not match this continuity. As April turned to May, the Reich's last defenses crumbled. American, British, and Soviet forces converged on the remnants of Hitler's empire. Shermans rolled into towns where white flags hung from windows, their engines idling in streets littered with rubble. In many places, German soldiers surrendered at the mere sight of approaching armor, knowing resistance was futile. The war in Europe was drawing to a close, and the Sherman had been there from the first American offensives to the final capitulation. Yet the story of the Sherman did not end with Germany's surrender. Even as VE Day approached, thousands of Shermans were being prepared for redeployment to the Pacific. Plans were underway for the invasion of Japan, where Shermans would have supported amphibious landings and driven inland against entrenched defenses. Only the atomic bombings and Japan's surrender prevented this final chapter. In this sense, the Sherman was not just a European war machine but a global one, ready to project American power wherever it was needed. Looking back, historians often debate the Sherman's reputation. Critics focus on its vulnerability to German heavy tanks, its tendency to catch fire when hit, and its relatively light armor. Admirers emphasize its reliability, numbers, and adaptability. But most agree on one point: without the Sherman, the Allied advance across Europe would have been slower, bloodier, and perhaps less certain. It was the backbone of the armored force, the steady workhorse that carried armies forward while flashier weapons captured headlines. By the time Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the M4 Sherman had done more than silence the laughter of German generals. It had demonstrated a new paradigm of warfare, one where industrial capacity, standardized production, and integrated tactics could overwhelm even the most formidable tactical opponents. In that sense, the Sherman was not just a tank, it was the embodiment of an idea, one that reshaped military strategy for the rest of the 20th century. In the aftermath of Germany's surrender, the story of the Sherman tank entered a new chapter. As Europe tried to rebuild from the ruins of total war, thousands of Shermans remained parked on muddy fields, lined up on depots, or sent back to the United States for refurbishment. Some were scrapped, but many were transferred to Allied nations, Britain, France, Poland, the Soviet Union, and later even countries outside Europe. This redistribution transformed the Sherman from an American workhorse into a global symbol of post-war armored power. Everywhere it went, it carried with it the lessons of mass production, reliability, and adaptability. For American soldiers who had fought from Tunisia to the Rhine, the end of combat brought a strange mixture of relief and disbelief. The tank crews who had lived for months inside steel hulls suddenly found themselves idle, facing the question of what to do next. Many returned home, but a large number stayed in the army of occupation, patrolling the shattered German landscape in their familiar Shermans. These patrols were less about combat than about maintaining order, deterring any potential insurgency, showing the flag, and providing visible reassurance to civilians. In the eyes of war-weary Europeans, the Sherman's silhouette, once a harbinger of destruction, began to take on the meaning of stability and peacekeeping. Meanwhile, U.S. planners were already shifting their gaze to the Pacific. Even before Germany's collapse, factories in the Midwest had been producing modified Shermans designed for amphibious operations against Japan. Engineers tested wading kits, flamethrowers, and heavier guns for the expected invasion of Kyushu and Honshu. Marines trained to operate alongside Shermans on beaches studded with pillboxes and caves. The tank that had crossed the deserts of North Africa and the hedgerows of Normandy was now being adapted for jungles and volcanic islands. Had the war continued, the Sherman would have spearheaded another vast campaign, perhaps facing Japanese tanks, fortifications, and suicidal defenses. The sudden end of the Pacific War in August 1945 left thousands of these Shermans without an immediate mission. Yet their very existence illustrated the scale of American production. No other nation in history had ever fielded such numbers of a single armored vehicle type across multiple theaters simultaneously. This production record would influence U.S. military doctrine for decades. Officers who had commanded Sherman units rose to high ranks in the post-war army, carrying with them a mindset shaped by mobility, logistics, and cooperation between services. The Sherman experience became part of the DNA of the modern U.S. military. The Shermans' influence also reached beyond America. France used Shermans to rebuild its armored forces and fight in its colonial wars. Israel employed Shermans in its early conflicts, modifying them extensively for desert combat. South American nations acquired them for their armies. In some places, Shermans served into the 1970s and 1980s, long after more advanced tanks had entered service. This longevity was not an accident, it was a testament to the design's simplicity and upgrade potential. New guns, engines, and armor packages could be bolted on, extending the tank's life far beyond what its original designers had imagined in 1941. For the German generals who had once mocked American tanks, this global legacy was the ultimate refutation. The Sherman had not only defeated their armies but had gone on to shape the armored forces of half the world. Where German heavy tanks became museum pieces or rusting hulks, the Sherman became a living, evolving platform. In interviews and memoirs, some of these generals admitted their surprise and grudging respect. They had underestimated not just the tank but the system behind it, the industrial might, the training programs, and the logistical pipeline that made it unstoppable. The Sherman also left a deep imprint on military thought about quantity versus quality. Historians and strategists debated whether it was better to have a few highly advanced tanks or a large number of good enough tanks. The Second World War, with the Sherman at its center, seemed to support the latter view. A tank that could be produced quickly, repaired easily, and operated by ordinary soldiers often proved more decisive than a superweapon available in tiny numbers. This lesson influenced the design of Cold War tanks, including the American M48 and M60 series, which emphasized reliability and ease of production alongside firepower. Yet the Sherman story was also one of human adaptability. Crews who had once cursed its thin armor or limited gun power had learned to use its strengths, speed, maneuverability, communication, to offset its weaknesses. They had developed tactics for smoke screens, flanking maneuvers, and cooperative strikes with artillery and air power. This culture of adaptation became an enduring hallmark of the U.S. Army. It taught generations of soldiers that technology alone cannot win battles without flexible thinking and teamwork. In popular memory, the Sherman took on a double image. On one hand, it was the Ronson, or Tommy Cooker, a supposedly vulnerable machine immortalized in soldiers' dark humor. On the other hand, it was the steady companion, the tank that kept going when others broke down, the vehicle that delivered victory city after city. This duality gave rise to countless books, films, and documentaries. Hollywood portrayals from Patton to Fury continued to shape the public's image of the Sherman long after the war, sometimes exaggerating its flaws, sometimes glorifying its role. Yet even in fiction, the Sherman's iconic profile and its association with Allied victory endured. In the towns and villages of Europe, memorials still stand where Shermans were knocked out or where they liberated local populations. Some are restored and placed on pedestals, painted in their wartime markings, serving as silent witnesses to the battles of 70-plus years ago. Veterans return to these sites with their families, touching the cold steel, recalling comrades lost. The Sherman thus lives not only in museums but in the collective memory of the communities it affected. The broader context of armored warfare also shifted because of the Sherman's example. Post-war military schools studied how combined arms operations, logistics, and air superiority had amplified the effectiveness of relatively light tanks. They incorporated these lessons into new doctrines. NATO's early armored strategies bore the imprint of Sherman operations. Even Soviet planners, while fielding their own tank designs, acknowledged the importance of standardized mass production and integrated support networks, lessons they had learned partly from fighting alongside American equipment under Lend-Lease. By the early 1950s, the Sherman's combat career was far from over. In Korea, Upgraded Shermans fought against North Korean and Chinese forces, sometimes facing Soviet-supplied T-34s in duels reminiscent of Europe. Once again, the Shermans' reliability and the American supply system proved decisive. Mechanics kept them running in harsh conditions, and commanders used them creatively in mountainous terrain. This second act cemented the Shermans' reputation as one of the most enduring tanks in history. Reflecting on the entire saga, one can see that the laughter of the German generals at America's early tanks had long since faded into irrelevance. What they failed to grasp was that wars are not won by individual duels between tanks but by the sustained, coordinated effort of entire nations. The Sherman was the armored expression of that effort. It was not a champion gladiator but an army of competent soldiers marching together. In overwhelming numbers, with flexible tactics and logistical depth, it ground down one of the most formidable military machines in history. Even decades later, military historians continue to mine the Sherman story for insights. How did it manage to perform so many roles across so many theaters? How did its production scale shape Allied strategy? How did its crews develop tactics under fire? These questions matter because they reach beyond nostalgia. They point to the timeless principles of war. Mass, mobility, and adaptability still define success on the battlefield, whether the machines involved are tanks, drones, or ships. As a result, the Sherman stands not just as a relic of World War II but as a living lesson. It shows that underestimating an opponent's capacity to learn and produce is a fatal mistake. It shows that war is as much about organization as it is about technology. And it shows that the will of a free people, mobilized at industrial scale, can produce miracles of engineering and endurance. For the German generals who once laughed, this was the most sobering revelation of all. By the time the Sherman tank's legend had fully formed, it had transcended the confines of its steel armor and rivets. It became a cultural and strategic reference point for an entire generation. In the years following World War II, both military thinkers and ordinary citizens used the Sherman as shorthand for American industrial might, perseverance, and the philosophy of mass over perfection. For German generals who had once dismissed U.S. armor as clumsy and underpowered, the irony was complete. The Sherman had reshaped the battlefield and, indirectly, the post-war world order. The post-war decades saw the U.S. military transition to new tank designs like the M26 Pershing, M46 Patton, and eventually the M48 and M60 series. Yet each of these inherited something from the Sherman, not just components or technology but an ethos. That ethos was about designing for production, reliability, and rapid adaptation. Tank crews and commanders who had cut their teeth on Shermans carried those lessons into Korea, Vietnam, and the Cold War standoffs in Europe. In NATO exercises across the plains of Germany during the 1950s and 1960s, echoes of the Sherman's tactical doctrine could still be felt in the way armored units moved, coordinated, and relied on logistical backbones. Meanwhile, abroad, the Sherman's global legacy flourished. In Israel's hands, Shermans modified with French 75mm and 105mm guns fought in the 1956 Suez Crisis and the 1967 Six-Day War. In some cases, these upgraded Shermans destroyed much more modern tanks through cunning tactics and skillful crew performance. In Latin America, Shermans patrolled borders and even saw action in small conflicts and revolutions. This ability to remain relevant long after its original debut reflected the design's fundamental soundness. Countries with limited defense budgets could afford Shermans, maintain them, and even innovate with them. Each foreign iteration extended the Sherman's mythos further, making it one of the few tanks instantly recognizable across continents. The psychological effect of this global presence cannot be overstated. For civilians, seeing a Sherman roll down their street, whether in Paris 1944, Jerusalem 1956, or Saigon 1968, evoked images of Allied victory and American power. For soldiers, it was a familiar workspace, a machine they could trust to start in the morning, cross rough terrain, and fire when needed. This reliability built confidence, and confidence translated into performance. Even opponents learned to respect it. In conflicts from the Middle East to Central America, adversaries came to recognize the Sherman as a foe that might be old but was never entirely obsolete. In the U.S. itself, the Sherman became a fixture of parades, veterans' reunions, and war movies. Town squares and memorial parks installed decommissioned Shermans as monuments, their barrels pointing skyward, their armor painted with fresh olive drab. Schoolchildren climbed on them during field trips, learning that this was the tank that had helped liberate Europe and defeat tyranny. Museums curated exhibits around the Sherman's history, collecting oral testimonies from surviving crewmen. In this way, the tank became not only a war machine but a bridge between generations, teaching younger Americans about sacrifice, ingenuity, and the mechanics of industrial democracy. But beyond nostalgia, military analysts continued to mine the Sherman story for lessons about future conflicts. The balance between quantity and quality, between simplicity and sophistication, remained a live debate in defense ministries worldwide. The emergence of nuclear weapons and missiles did not erase the relevance of armored warfare. If anything, it underscored the need for survivable, mobile platforms in conventional conflicts. The Sherman's performance served as a case study in the benefits of standardization, modularity, and logistical depth, principles that would apply as much to jets and warships as to tanks. Some critics tried to rewrite the Sherman's reputation, arguing that its numerical advantage masked fatal flaws. They cited high crew casualties in Normandy, the dreaded brewing up of fuel and ammunition after penetrations, and the shock of encountering tigers and panthers in hedgerows. Yet even these critics often conceded that no tank could have been perfect under such conditions. The question was never whether the Sherman was invincible but whether it could accomplish its mission within the broader Allied system. On that metric, it excelled. The Sherman advanced, supported infantry, seized ground, and kept pressure on the enemy, all while being maintainable and replaceable. It fulfilled its strategic purpose with unrelenting consistency. As Cold War tensions grew, U.S. planners faced a new potential adversary, the Soviet Union, whose own tank forces dwarfed anything fielded in World War II. Ironically, Soviet designers had learned some of the same lessons as the Americans. Their T-34, like the Sherman, emphasized production and reliability. In a hypothetical showdown on the plains of Europe, NATO's doctrine would echo the combined arms approach perfected with Shermans: integrate tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support into a seamless whole. In this sense, the Sherman was not just a tank of the past but a blueprint for the future of mechanized warfare. By the 1970s and 1980s, the last Shermans in frontline service were finally being retired, yet even then they appeared in unexpected places. Militias and smaller armies fielded them in regional wars, collectors restored them for reenactments, engineers studied them to understand the evolution of tank design. The Sherman thus maintained a kind of afterlife, its steel hulls echoing across decades of geopolitical change. For the German generals who had once laughed at U.S. tanks, the sight of Sherman variants still clanking into battle 30 years later would have been unimaginable. In reflecting on this long arc, one sees a deeper truth. The Sherman was not merely a response to a moment of crisis but an expression of a national capacity. It showed how a democracy could outproduce and out-organize a dictatorship, not by building superweapons but by mobilizing average citizens and practical designs. It demonstrated that the real power of an army lies not in a single piece of hardware but in the ecosystem that sustains it. And it underscored the importance of humility, for the Allies, who had to improve their tactics, and for their enemies, who underestimated them. Today, standing in front of a preserved Sherman in a museum or at a memorial, one can still sense the weight of history. Its welded plates and simple lines contrast with the high-tech tanks of the modern era, yet its aura of determination remains. This was the tank that crossed oceans, deserts, and rivers, that carried soldiers into the heart of occupied Europe, that kept moving when the odds were long and the enemy fierce. It was, in many ways, the armored embodiment of a promise, that freedom, when organized and determined, could prevail over tyranny. For military professionals and historians alike, the Sherman remains an enduring case study. Its successes and failures both teach lessons about innovation, logistics, and the human element of warfare. It warns against the temptation to dismiss an opponent's capacity, and it celebrates the resilience of ordinary soldiers operating extraordinary machines. In the final analysis, the Sherman story is not about armor thickness or gun caliber but about adaptation, perseverance, and the will to fight smarter, not just harder. Thus, the laughter of the German generals fades into the background of history. In its place stands a legacy measured not only in battles won but in doctrines shaped, allies supported, and generations influenced. The Sherman tank was more than steel on tracks. It was a moving piece of strategy, a rolling manifestation of industrial democracy, and a symbol of how the underdog can triumph through persistence and scale. Its story did not end in 1945, nor in 1950, nor even in 1970. It continues wherever armies study the past to prepare for the future, and wherever citizens remember the price and power of freedom. In the final reflection on the Sherman tank's journey, it becomes clear that its true significance lies not just in the battles it fought but in the ideas it represented. From the dusty training grounds of the American Midwest to the shattered streets of Berlin, the Shermans stood for the notion that determined people and coordinated effort could defeat even the most formidable foe. It was a story about courage and learning under fire, about engineers and mechanics as much as gunners and drivers, about an entire society mobilized for a single purpose. For the crews who served inside these tanks, the memories were deeply personal. They remembered the clank of the treads at dawn, the smell of oil and cordite, the nervous silence before an attack. They remembered their first encounter with German armor and the fear it provoked, then the slow confidence that grew as they adapted tactics, improved their gunnery, and saw reinforcements rolling in. Each tank was its own small world, a steel cocoon housing a team of men who trusted each other with their lives. Some of these veterans would later say that the Sherman was not perfect but that it never let them down when it counted most. The symbolism of the Sherman extended beyond the military. It told a story about American industry, which had transformed from producing consumer goods to producing war machines at a scale the world had never seen. It told a story about democracy's ability to innovate rapidly under pressure, to build a war machine without becoming a war state. It told a story about partnership as Shermans fought alongside British Churchills, Soviet T-34s, and French resistance fighters, embodying an allied effort that transcended borders. As the decades passed, the Shermans' legacy became embedded in the very DNA of modern warfare. The emphasis on mobility, logistics, and integrated support is visible today in the way armed forces deploy drones, armored vehicles, and air support in coordinated waves. The principles first proven on the battlefields of Europe in 1944 still guide planning rooms and war colleges around the world. Even today's most advanced tanks, with computerized fire controls and composite armor, trace their lineage back to lessons learned from the M4's campaigns. Yet perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Sherman tank is the reminder of human adaptability. It began as an underdog, lighter, less armed, mocked by its enemies, and evolved into a symbol of unstoppable momentum. Its crews learned to improvise, to use terrain, to call for support, to innovate in the field. Its engineers learned to tweak the design, add new weapons, and upgrade armor. This cycle of feedback and improvement created a virtuous loop that multiplied its effectiveness. In an age when technology advances at breakneck speed, the Sherman story remains a testament to the power of iteration and learning. For the German generals who once laughed at U.S. tanks, the final score was undeniable. Their supertanks lay burning on the battlefield or rusting in depots, their production lines choked by Allied bombing and resource shortages. The Sherman, meanwhile, rolled on, across North Africa, Italy, France, the Low Countries, Germany, and into the post-war world. It had become more than a weapon. It was a statement. Quantity, when combined with quality and strategy, could break even the strongest defense. Flexibility, when combined with courage, could outlast even the most intimidating firepower. Today, when we look at photographs of Shermans lined up in endless rows or see one preserved in a museum, we are not just looking at a machine. We are looking at a chapter of human history, a moment when ordinary men climbed into steel boxes and drove toward danger, believing that their collective effort could change the world. We are looking at a reminder that victory is rarely about a single piece of equipment but about the people, ideas, and systems that make that equipment effective. This is why, even in the 21st century, the Sherman tank still fascinates historians, soldiers, and the public. It represents the triumph of persistence over hubris, of organization over improvisation, and of democracy over tyranny. It also serves as a cautionary tale about underestimation, a reminder that dismissing an opponent as backward or incapable can be a fatal mistake. These are lessons as relevant today as they were in 1944. As we close this story, imagine standing on a field in Normandy or outside Bastogne or along the Rhine, where Shermans once rumbled forward under fire. The air smells of wet earth and diesel, the sky gray with low clouds. In the distance, you hear the rumble of engines and the clatter of treads, the sound of an army in motion, relentless, determined. That sound was the soundtrack of liberation for millions and the doom of regimes built on conquest and terror. And now, decades later, as you watch or listen to this story, you are part of keeping that memory alive. Every time you learn about the Sherman, you are engaging with the human drama behind the steel, the engineers who worked late nights to perfect a design, the dockworkers who loaded tanks onto ships, the tank crews who risked everything on the front lines. You are participating in a chain of remembrance that honors not only a machine but the spirit of those who used it. If this story inspired you, or if you learned something new about the Sherman tank and the men who fought in it, take a moment to share that knowledge. Talk to friends, visit a museum, read a veteran's memoir. And if you're watching this on our channel, make sure to subscribe, like, and leave a comment about what fascinated you most. Your engagement helps keep these stories alive and ensures that future generations understand how history was shaped not just by famous leaders but by ordinary people and the machines they built. The laughter of the German generals has long since faded into silence, but the echo of the Sherman's engines still rolls through history. It is a sound of steel and determination, of thousands of individuals working together, of an idea too big to be stopped. And it is a sound that reminds us, even now, that resilience, innovation, and unity can achieve what once seemed impossible.